Thank you, Ali. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for your time and your commitment over the next 35 minutes or so. People have joined this webinar from many countries around the world, and I do thank you for your attendance. As has already been indicated, my name is Peter Crow. I am speaking to you from New Zealand. It's just gone 1 a.m. These are the joys of the internet and time zones, that we can talk with each other at almost any time. Let's get started, though, with the core of the webinar. These are the 4 topics that I'm going to be exploring with you today. I'll address each in turn, and we'll have plenty of time for questions afterwards. So, as has already been indicated, please feel free to pose questions when I finish the talk. Our starting point is a candid analysis of the current operating context of boards of directors. Boards and the companies they serve do not operate in isolation from the wider business environment. If directors and boards are to be effective in serving the purposes of the companies that put them there, they need to both understand and respond to a complex and socially dynamic environment. Let's look at a few of those challenges that boards need to cope with. First, there are pressures from outside the company. Regardless of our geography, we live in a rapidly changing world, and there are few absolutes, be it Brexit, commodity pricing, immigration, war, the rise of the digital economy, cyber threats, cybersecurity responses, the Internet of Things, fintech, Bitcoin, regulations and codes, and of course, shareholder demands for returns on an ongoing basis. These are all examples of external pressures that demand a response from boards. And that list keeps growing, doesn't it? Turning inwards, boards themselves are not immune to challenge and change, whether it's an alpha male chief executive that's trying to run the business. Should our boards focus on conformance and making sure the company is complying with all the requirements, or performance and chasing the overall goals? How should labour be divided between the board and the chief executive? Who does what? Often it's not clear. Some directors also have a propensity for detail, zealously scrutinising everything in the board report in detail. Last week I was told a story in a professional development session. One of the participants was saying that in one of his board meetings that he's recently left, the chief executive would walk through their own board report, 8 to 10 pages, typically 2 hours long. And it was because 2 of the directors wanted to litigate almost everything. The crazy thing, everything that had been described had already happened. You couldn't undo those things. Other challenges for boards: many directors simply do not understand the business of the business that they govern. And of course, many boards place a high priority on keeping out of trouble, and consequently, the strategic mindset is weak. Add to these challenges common misunderstandings of how boards should or could work. Here are some popular perspectives, most of which emerged as recommendations from the research community and regulators 20 and 30 years ago. The underlying assumption here is that the board is a policeman to keep control of management, to defend and act in the best interests of shareholders, and keep things on track. The view in this context is that if boards are aloof, if they're independent, they could monitor management and exert control more effectively. But do they? Boards have also embraced a range of structural configurations in response to recommendations from regulators, codes of practice, and other sources. But, and this is where, if you will, the rubber meets the road, sadly, none of those responses have made any direct and predictable difference in terms of overall company. In fact, the added complexity of 30 years of statutes, codes of compliance, and other compliance measures has taken the board's eye away from its primary job to ensure company performance. Think about these companies and the underlying failures. One of the research articles I was reading recently suggests that the compliance measures put in place after the Enron failure, so these are things like Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank, have actually been a contributing factor to more recent failures, particularly those of the GFC. This candid introduction exposes a real dilemma that boards need to struggle with and address. On the one hand, boards are duty-bound to ensure the performance of the company. Yet on the other, they have compliance responsibilities. Is it more important for boards to protect value, the conformance view, or to pursue increased value and gain returns, the performance view? And how much time should boards spend facing forward versus checking past performance? Boards need to debate this dilemma on a periodic basis and resolve it. If they don't, their role, almost by definition, is reduced to that of a cost centre, which adds little if any value, receiving reports, signing off a few things, and going home again. That might sound a little bit cynical, but when that happens, the chief executive is left to run the company as they see fit. And those logos on the previous slide provide many stories of what can happen if the chief executive is left to run alone. Having briefly acknowledged the current reality for many boards and companies, let's move our attention to the crucial role that the board could play, that can play in value creation. To do that, we need to visit a term that has become somewhat overused in recent years, corporate governance. You'll see on the picture here some sailors sailing a racing yacht. And this is a very good image of what governance actually is, because the word governance comes from a Greek root, kybernetes, to steer, to guide, to pilot. So this implies an active, not a passive contribution. It's not a passenger, but decisions need to be made in the yachting context based on the tide, the wind, the waves, what the nearby competitive yachts are doing, what the sail's doing, all of these things. All of those factors are what drives the yacht forward, not the captain, who is the board. In 1960, only 56 years ago now, Richard Eales, an academic, first used the term corporate governance, and he used it to describe or to define the structure and functioning of the corporate polity, that is, the board. Subsequently, a very famous definition was provided by Sir Adrian Cadbury, who was commissioned by the British government in 1992 to do a review following some failures in the London City financial district. And he suggested that corporate governance is the means by which companies are directed and controlled. And of course, we know that boards are made up of company directors. So corporate governance, quite simply, is a term that describes what boards do. Corporate governance, is it needed all the time? Well, certainly it's needed when ownership of shareholding and decision-making control, that is management, are separated. So certainly, from most companies of medium size and upwards where owners are not involved in the day-to-day management of the company, corporate governance can and is very beneficial if performed well. This is the best corporate governance framework that I've seen in over 20 years of board practice, directorships, and governance research. It defines the crucial roles of the board. Fred Hilmer and Bob Garrett did the work over 20 years ago in the mid-90s, and subsequently Bob Tricker refined it. The framework has two dimensions. Across the bottom, and if you'll allow me with the arrows here, across the bottom, there's a future focus and a historical focus. And upwards, there's an inward view and a beyond the company view. So the four cells that the board needs to be involved in include determining the purpose and strategy of the company. That's a future-focused, outward-facing activity. And then coming around, setting the rules, the policies, the culture, monitoring what has been achieved, and supervising the chief executive. And then, of course, providing accountability. The board is accountable to the shareholder, but also the external regulators. The fifth cell, right here in the middle, recognizes that the board does not operate the company directly itself. That work is performed by the chief executive. So the board needs to approve the work of the chief executive and work with and through the chief to achieve the goals of the company. Crucially, the role of the board is to act in all four cells, not necessarily always the same amount of time in each one, different emphases, make sense at different times. The crucial point is to be active in all cells, nevertheless. If you'd like to read more, the recommended book is this, The Fish Rots from the Head, an unusual title, but a very memorable one. Developing Effective Board Directors by Bob Garrett. It's readily available, very, very readable. My copy is just about worn out, and I'll be getting a new one soon. It's great. It was written a long time ago, but it's great. The implication of that framework that we've just worked through is that effective contributions in the boardroom are dependent on what board directors do and how directors behave, much more so than how the board is structured. If we accept that the board is responsible for company performance, then the board needs to make some decisions about how that performance might be achieved. The very biggest of decisions, because the board is conceived in law as the senior-most decision-making authority. So the biggest decisions that boards need to make concern the selection of strategy and the selection of the chief executive to implement that strategy. But not just strategy. Four important elements need to come together if boards are to focus on the future and achieve the overall aims of the company. Let's look at them briefly in turn. The starting point for effective board contributions is a clear sense of purpose. Why does your company exist? What is its reason for being? The man pictured here, Martin Luther King, an American civil rights leader in the mid-60s, exemplified the approach needed. He helped us to understand that people don't get behind things, but rather they get behind causes. Here he was delivering his "I have a dream" speech, because most powerfully, people get galvanized around a common purpose. It's no different in companies. At the heart of any company's success is a clear understanding of why it exists and a clear commitment to fight for that purpose. Without it, the company is reduced, the staff are reduced to performing activities. The board has a crucial role in determining this, ideally with considerable input from the shareholders. To illustrate the impact of this point, let me tell you a story. I was recently asked to assess a board that was having trouble making decisions and having trouble moving the company forward. And the chief executive was becoming quite frustrated. So I went in, and my first job was to listen. So I met individually with each director, all 9 of them. And amongst other questions, I asked whether they knew why their company existed. They all did. In fact, they all told me, all 9 of them. The difficulty was when I analysed the responses, I had 7 different responses. Imagine sitting in a boardroom with 8 other colleagues and sitting in 7 different directions. How easy would it be to make binding universal decisions to go in a certain way? No wonder that board was dysfunctional. But sadly, that board was not alone. Research from America a couple of years ago, Barton and Wiseman, it was written up in Harvard Business Review, suggests that 1 in every 6, yes, that's right, 16% of board directors are able to explain and comprehend the operating context and the impact of the operating context of the company, leaving 5/6, 84%, that can't or can't do that effectively. The second of the 4 elements, values. Does your company have a clear and concise set of values upon which all of the activities of the company and all of the behaviours of the staff are based? And speaking of behaviours, are the behaviour standards that you set in the boardroom and expect in terms of the day-to-day conduct of the board, the executive, the staff, everybody, are they not only directly aligned with each other, but are they also directly aligned with the value system? Or have you got the situation like these monkeys where you hear no evil, you see no evil, and you speak no evil, and you just get on with your work in a suboptimal environment? Finally, to strategy. Like the term governance, strategy is a word that is commonly uttered, yet it's widely misunderstood. The term actually has military origins, strategos, meaning general or the art of command. The implication here is that strategy is something that happens at the top end of organisations and that it happens before engagement. In our context, companies. So the implication is that strategy and boards need to go together. Increasingly, boards are recognising this. They're claiming to be involved in strategy and strategic decision making, which is good. Surveys by McKinsey and others suggest that directors spend around 25% of their time in board meetings on strategy or strategy-related matters. That's the claim. But in my experience, and I know for many others, if you put a stopwatch on what actually happens in boardrooms as a silent observer, you get quite a different picture. The reality is rather less. Single-digit percentages. So that spins up a rather interesting question. Maybe directors don't understand what strategy is. Maybe we talk about it, but they don't understand what it is. Or they do understand what it is, but they don't want to look bad, so they elevate their answers. At the end of the day, strategy comes down to 4 crucial questions. Where are we now? Where do we want to go? How do we get there? And the measurement question, how do we know? These are the 4 key questions. And in case you're wondering, this is not new news. Researchers over 25 years ago put together this model in the context of mission achievement, Campbell and Jung. Purpose, values, behaviour standards, and strategy, all clearly defined, all self-evident, all coherent and congruent, needed if the mission of the organisation is to be achieved. No more, no less. Around about the same time, Bob Tricker, whom I mentioned earlier, suggested that strategic management, a concept that will be familiar to many of you, but just in case, strategic management being the tasks of developing strategy, approving strategy, and making strategic decisions, that is, implementing strategy, and then monitoring and reporting progress. Tricker said, strategic management is most appropriately placed right at the nexus, the intersection of board and management interaction. It's these 2 ideas, this cohesive view of achievement of mission and strategic management at that intersection of board and management, these 2 ideas that are both at odds with contemporary board practice, actually motivated my research and a relatively new understanding of how boards can influence performance from the boardroom. So let's move to the 3rd section. Let's have a look at what effective boards do. The discussion to this point has demonstrated that boards face many challenges and that many boards spend much of their time focused on compliance matters and, in some cases, protecting their reputation. Yet boards are accountable in law for the performance of the company. Over the last 5 years, as I've investigated boards that are intent on making an impact, I've sat inside boardrooms on an ongoing basis over time, well more than a year, to understand what they actually do, how they actually work. And so this research has involved sitting there observing the boards of 2 large high-growth companies, both privately held, over an extended period of over 12 months, and then gathering data from meeting minutes, board packs over multiple years, interviews, and trying to make some sense of the data. The analysis revealed some interesting findings, some of which sit quite uncomfortably with common recommendations. This diagram, seemingly complex when we first look at it, illustrates how effective boards work. It's actually relatively straightforward. Let me explain. I'll use the mouse again. Starting around the outside, right up the top here, this is the effective long-term purpose of the company. So the grey box right around, that is the platform, the basis, that is the purpose of the company, that is what we're trying to achieve. It needs to be both clearly defined and communicated well on an ongoing basis. The engine room in the diagram are these 4 dark red boxes in the middle. This is the strategic management cycle, that framework that will be familiar to many of you. It starts right in the middle here with the development of strategy, right here, and then moves around, having developed strategy to make strategic decisions, implement those decisions, and then monitor the performance achieved as a result of, and then refining strategy. So that's an ongoing process in businesses. The two sets of lines, dashed lines, one up through the middle here and one right around the bottom, these show recommended divisions of labour. This one at the bottom relates to the board, and this one up through the middle relates to tasks assigned to management. Note the overlap around the development of strategy. This is a vital difference from many configurations and many recommendations. Usually, the development of strategy is assigned to management, perhaps with some board input, or the board takes it for itself, perhaps with some management input. This model suggests that a much more collaborative approach, intentionally so, where the board and management work absolutely together on that development of strategy task, is a good model for more effective contributions. Before we look at these 5 underlying aspects, and I'll come to them on the next slide, we should recognise that this model describes how boards can be effective, but it does not guarantee the performance outcomes. You see many factors outside the business, so banking covenants, competitor activities, supply and demand, or inside the company, the motivation and morale of staff, the effectiveness of the leadership of the chief executive, they can influence performance despite the best efforts of the board and of management. Moving now to those underlying characteristics. Strategic competence. This encapsulates the capability, intelligence, and cognition of directors. That is, their ability to apply relevant skills, expertise, and knowledge to perform those defined tasks effectively. Active engagement refers to a demonstrable commitment by the directors individually to the board, to the job of the board, and to the overall aims of the company, and to do so with high in-role performance. It includes adequate preparation before meetings, intentional participation in discussions and debate during meetings, and in the strategic decision-making. It also includes, where appropriate, other activities outside the board meeting that are relevant to the company. These might include customer visits, they might include representation in lobby groups, or representing the company at award events and other activities, for example. The third of these characteristics, a sense of purpose. This describes the underlying motivation and resolve of individual directors to contribute to the work of the board, and importantly, with the agreed vision and long-term purpose of the company as the primary guiding principle. Collective efficacy. This might be a term unfamiliar to many. Collective efficacy refers to the characteristics of cooperation, situational awareness, social exchange, and the commitment displayed by the directors as they work together to make decisions, to trust each other, and to secure the commitment of management to implement the decisions made by the board. Finally, constructive control refers to the appropriate actions of the board as a collective of directors in response to various inputs. Now, whether that's written and verbal reports, tacit knowledge, answers to questions that they might ask during board meetings. Constructive controls are analogous to those used by a coach providing guidance rather than the punitive or destructive responses that might otherwise be common in some boardrooms. The important element here is that the harmonious activation of these 5 underlying characteristics is an important foundation to effective boardroom contributions as boards engage in that strategic management process. And this is the model that was shown on the previous slide. Now, while better performance is not guaranteed, what we can absolutely say is that if any of these 5 characteristics are absent or not displayed, the board's ability to exert any meaningful influence is severely compromised. Turning now to the final part of our discussion today, some practical implications, some so whats, and some takeaways. The first implication is on the board's time, how much time it spends and what it spends its time doing. Boards need to review how time is allocated within board meetings. Historically, and even today, most boards spend most of their time on compliance and monitoring activities, as indicated particularly by the size of the compliance wheel here. Given the model for effective contributions we've just discussed, what are the implications for how a board should perhaps spend its time? I would really like to give you an exact answer, but I'm sorry, there is no one-size-fits-all answer, simply because every situation is different. An industrial company involved in a hazardous situation, for example, oil exploration or forestry or mining of some sort, necessarily needs to spend more time on health and safety and compliance than a professional services office-bound company, and that's fine. But all boards need to spend time on all of these. The interesting thing is that the biggest allocation in boardrooms of high-performing companies is strategy. Boards of high-performing companies spend at least half of their time on strategy, understanding the business of the business, debating strategic options, making strategic decisions, and, crucially, reviewing that strategy is both implemented as planned and that the expected benefits are being achieved. Important questions that high-performing boards should be asking include these 4 questions. The first 3 focus on purpose, strategy, and execution. They move the board's attention towards the future performance of the company. The 4th question, in my experience, is really asked, but it is absolutely crucial. It is, in effect, a self-evaluation question. It should be asked at the end of every board meeting. If directors are to learn and improve and to contribute well in the future, they need to reflect and they need to critique their work. The emphasis on strategy can be a real challenge for boards. So boards need to intentionally focus strategy in their meeting priorities. Otherwise, strategy will fall off as other things press in. So the challenge of keeping purpose and strategy alive should not be underestimated. Here are some suggestions. Perhaps resequencing the agenda so that the important items happen first. What are the important items? Well, if there are strategic decisions to be made, if there are reviews of strategic options to be considered, they should occur early in the agenda. Items that typically occur early can happen much later, like, for example, the approval of minutes of previous meetings, the reception of the chief executive and financial reports. Now, this is not to say that we ignore those. Directors still need to ask questions, but if we put it late, we won't spend that much more time on what's already gone. We'll be spending our time on what's yet to occur. If boards are to keep looking forward, the chairman has a crucial role to play. We need to make sure that reporting is aligned with strategic priorities, that the board report itself fits the needs of the board, and the board has a crucial role of letting the chief executive know what they need, how much writing or pictures or otherwise they need to see. Otherwise, the chief executive will simply guess, and that might be wrong. So that's about all we have time for today. We've explored the challenges modern boards face, the board's role in value creation, what effective boards do, and some practical considerations. Now, while there are no guarantees, before we do open for questions and explore some of these items, can I leave this quote with you to ponder? The secret of change is to focus all of our energy, if I can paraphrase, all of our energy, not on fighting the old, but on building the new. If as directors, we're going to contribute well to the future performance of the company, our focus needs to move to building that new world. To everybody that's been listening, thank you very much. I think we now have time for questions. Can I pass back to you, Ali?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Crow, for a very, very intriguing presentation. Folks, we are now open for question and answers. If you have any questions, you can always insert your questions in the question chat box, or you could put it, you could raise your hand. There's a hand icon available on the console, and you will be able to speak directly to Mr. Crow if you raise your hand. So let me go. There are a couple of questions in the question box. Let me read the first one. Is governance the same for all types of companies and non-company organizations?
What a great question. Thank you for asking. We know within individual countries there is one law for companies. So whether it's can I use the UK as an example? Whether it's a small company for a delivery business for 3 or 4 people, or BP, the big oil company, there is only one law. But crucially, the way that the board works and the types of things that it focuses on at BP are going to be quite different than an organisation needs to focus on that's a small organisation. So the recognition here is that corporate governance can take many, many different forms for different types of company, and also it can take different forms in different contexts in the life of a company.
Thank you very much. We have another one from Mr. Neville Yant. The question is, what hope are for the employees where the alpha male board dominates? Is an Enron or BHS or Deutsche Bank the only outcome?
Those are interesting situations, aren't they? Thank you. I was in London 10 days ago doing an interview for another party, and I was asked about Brexit, BHS, Sports Direct, so similar situations. The alpha male, I think, in most of those cases was the chief executive, and the board in some of those cases was actually relatively permissive. Shareholders have an important part to play here. If there is a dominant chief executive and the shareholders can see that and they've got concerns that the board may not be holding that chief executive to account, then the shareholders need to work to review the performance of those board members, and if necessary, if they feel it's necessary, to replace them through the voting process that occurs at annual meetings. It's very difficult though. Here in New Zealand, we had a situation where one of our highly esteemed company directors, chairman, Mr. John Palmer, chairman of Air New Zealand, our airline, and he worked very well with what we know as a rock star chief executive, so an alpha male, and that company performed incredibly well over a decade of time. At the same time, Mr. John Palmer was also the chairman of our coal mining company, Solid Energy, and they also had a rock star chief executive, but unfortunately John Palmer and the board at Solid Energy were unsuccessful and the company failed. It went into administration simply because the board did not spend the time and did not ask the right questions to discover that the chief executive, despite it being a state coal mining company, the chief executive was more interested in building a biofuels and alternative energy company. So the challenge here is to get alignment between the chief executive and the board and the shareholder, and for the shareholder to participate in the process through the annual meeting. It's not straightforward. I think also though that regulatory responses such as is being mooted in the UK at the moment with employee directors and other treatments are simply putting extra layers of compliance in. The challenge is to work on the behaviours. It's a long-term problem.
Thank you very much. We have another one from Brother Muhammad Al-Taiba. The question is, what are the KPIs to measure the effectiveness of a board, and how to determine that the fault is caused by board and not by CEO? Usually if there's a failure in company, the CEO will take the blame.
First, I want to thank you for the question and also acknowledge that there are cultural differences in different places around the world. So my primary experience is through the Western world and through Asia, and I want to acknowledge now that I hope my response is meaningful in the Gulf states as well. So the question is really around the failure and who, if you will, takes the blame and what the appropriate measures and KPIs are. The board is complex, it's a structure, it's socially dynamic, so that makes it incredibly difficult to determine whether the board exactly carried all or some of the blame for a failure or not, or all of the blame or not for the success of the company, and how much of that lay with the chief executive. Ultimately, the performance of the company is with the board. So I'm of the view that if the company fails in a major way, then it's appropriate to look at the board of directors first. Conscious that in some Gulf states that can be a challenge, particularly with the ownership of some important companies. But I say that respectfully, first and foremost. Appropriate KPIs are related to the strategic priorities of the company and the overall purpose of the company that's determined. So you'll remember the diamond. We had purpose at the top and strategy on the side. If the purpose of the company is well defined, and if there are strategic priorities around growth, around customers, around products, for example, then usually it's relatively straightforward to identify somewhere in the order of 4 to 6 high-level performance measures that can be reported both to the board and to the market, so we can determine whether the company is tracking well or not. However, that's not enough. We also need independent board evaluations on a regular and ongoing basis. My recommendation is once every 12 months to commission an external party to observe some board meetings, to interview some directors, to review board packs and board minutes, and to form a view as to whether this board is performing at a high level, at an average level, or at a low level, and those recommendations are published not only to the board but also to the shareholders. So there's some suggestions.
Thank you very much. Another one from Mr. Paul Greasley. What are the differences between boards of for-profit and non-profit organizations?
The ownership is diffuse. That's the first thing. So in a company structure, and I'm going to speak to Commonwealth countries primarily. This is pretty much the case also in Japan and the US, but my knowledge of law in some other parts of the world is much less. Companies, boards and directors in the Commonwealth type countries are required to act in the best interest of the company, and because it's a legal person. And so directors need to act as a collective and act in that way. Contrast that with trusts and charitable entities for which profit is not the primary motive but some social agenda. They need to act in the best interest of the beneficiaries. So on one hand, the model that we explored, the types of priorities, the commitments of directors are generally similar. However, the underlying motivation for profit or not for profit, and whether we're acting in the best interests of either the company or the beneficiaries, do make a difference. Also, it's often very difficult to identify, particularly in a publicly listed company, who are the shareholders and what are the overall goals of the company. That can also be a problem with passionate people running not-for-profit social agencies as well. So I would assert that the difference from a board perspective is primarily around the motivations and who they're going to act in the best interests of.
Thank you very much. We have a supplementary from Mr. Brother Muhammad Al-Tahib regarding the KPIs question. Can you suggest some references which we can consult on the subject?
Yes, I won't do that verbally. Can I do that through you, Mr. Ali? Because I will need to go and provide,
Sure.
do some research myself just to make sure that I provide current information to you. Is that
Sure,
okay?
please. Yeah, you just let me know and we'll just share it with the attendees.
Okay, that'll be fine.
Yeah. Okay, let me go to another one. The model from your research suggests that if the underlying characteristics are present, then performance will follow. Is this correct?
No, I made that point, hopefully. If I didn't make it clearly, I'm sorry to the person that's asked that question. The research showed in the two boards over that period of time, both were growing at high rates, greater than 20% compound annual growth rate in revenue terms. One of the boards was highly engaged, displayed all of those underlying characteristics, and was demonstrably contributing high value. The other board was much less so. The interesting thing is that growth can occur despite or in spite of those contributions. Equally, the company's boards can display the harmonious interaction of those attributes, but other factors get in the way, and that can limit growth. So this is about saying if boards are to influence performance, these characteristics appear to be pretty important, but they're not predictable in terms of a relationship to firm performance. So if I can use the word causality, this is not causality. There's too many other factors. It's an indirect relationship.
Very much. We have one last question from Brother Muhammad Saif. The question is, if I may ask you to summarize the whole presentation in one slide, which one would be that? What would be the key takeaway for us?
Oh, no. Gosh, that's a tough question, sir. Let me do my best. I'm just pulling. I've actually got. I'll leave that question slide on the screen. I presume everybody can still see that. I've got a printout copy here. I think there are. I'm going to cheat by offering two comments. One is the model. The model picture provides a conceptual understanding of how the mechanism of corporate governance can work. But I think the slide that is, I believe, slide 13, its title is Governance Framework. It comes, it's the 2x2 matrix immediately prior to the graphic image of fish rots from the head, which I believe is slide 14. So it's the 2x2 matrix, Garrett and Hilmer's governance framework. That is absolutely crucial. That talks about what boards do. The model that I've developed talks about how boards go about doing their work.
Great, thank you very much, sir. And that really brings us towards the end of the webinar. Mr. Crow, any concluding remarks that you would like to give before we dismiss that?
I would like to offer my sincere thanks to all of the participants. I understand there was a large number that have called in from many different places. I truly thank you for your attendance, for your questions. And you can see on the page there that if you have any supplementary questions, if you want to talk to me about anything, there's an email address, a telephone number, and also a Twitter account. And as Mr. Ali Jaffrey has already mentioned, there is a website called www.petercrow.com. Although I would ask one thing, smiling, the time here is now nearly 2 a.m. and when I'm finished this, I'm going to bed, so I don't really want to answer any immediate phone calls, but I'm happy to look at email. So thank you very, very much for participating. I'm happy to have further conversations if you wish.
Thank you. And I really want to thank you, Mr. Crow, for your willingness to deliver this live webinar at the midnight, as you mentioned. So I really want to thank you on behalf of Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship for sharing this valuable, very interesting information. So once again, thank you very much, sir. And thank you. Thank you all of those who participated in this webinar. We are recording it. Please stay tuned to webinar.ma.org to learn more about our upcoming webinars or equally to access the archive sections. I have also broadcasted in a chat box the link towards our upcoming 2 weeks leadership development program, advanced leadership development program. There's a golden opportunity primarily for the Saudi nationals to avail a scholarship being offered by Nava Munawwara from the Prince of Madinah. It's worth $12,000, and they're giving about 25 scholarship seats for this program. So it's an excellent golden opportunity to avail it. The website is NAMA, NAMAA.mile.org to learn more about the scholarship, as the program is scheduled to commence on October 7th. So we have only 5 days left. So please take time to visit the website and to learn more about it and apply for it as soon as you can. So thank you very much. With that note, I would like to end and conclude. So you all will be automatically dismissed out. You all have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are.